is due both to his uniqueness as a character and my own sentimental inclinations that I have always considered Quinlan Vos to be the poster boy of the expanded universe. He isn't even my favorite character in all honesty, but he's always been the first person I think of when it comes to characters from outside the films, and how they could contribute to the overarching narrative of Star Wars. I remember seeing him back in 2005 for the first time in a Borders bookstore. I was probably in 4th grade at the time, and I came across Star Wars Republic issue 77. Seeing him on the front cover, I was immediately drawn in, but very confused. He was obviously a Jedi of some sort, but he seemed unhinged and roguelike. I remember flipping through the pages and being all the more puzzled. My dad was an avid comic book collector during this time, and he taught me his method for tracking what he owned versus what he needed, and eventually, I gathered enough of the Republic comics to understand Quinlan Vos and his position upon Star Wars. He was the first person that I read of that largely broke away from the archetypical Jedi, and it's for this reason alone that I was devastated to see how he had been handled within both the Clone Wars TV series and his standalone novel, Dark Disciple. Before I go into how TCW and the new canon ruined Quinlan, I want to make a bit of a disclaimer. I do consider myself a fan of the Clone Wars animated show, and I do appreciate how much life it breathed into many of the characters we previously had little reason to care about or had been largely forgotten by Dark Horse Comics. While I think Quinlan Vos is in a terrible position with the new continuity, and his story potential realistically quite limited, I do have a bit of a solution towards the end that we'll talk about. Quinlan Vos, as shown in the Republic comic series, had one of the most unorthodox and unique character introductions we had seen at the time. Introduced during his bout of amnesia, learning of all of his previous relationships was an investigative process that we got to experience along with the character. I've always hated the typical amnesia character introductions, but this was done in a way that allowed Quinlan to form unusual companionships and reveal plot points that grew to prove that Quinlan and even his amnesia were just an aside to the massive planetary events he was embroiled in. This does not even consider the lingering temptation of the dark side residing within him, and many of the shocking actions he had taken part of, both in anger and with the best of intentions. Quinlan Vos' story would only grow more complicated and intriguing after reuniting with his apprentice and being back under the guidance of his master Thulm, where he would infiltrate the Separatist movement to uncover the one known as the Second Sith. In this time, he would be under the wing of Count Dooku as a dark acolyte, constantly battling the urge to surrender completely to the dark side in order to achieve his goals. We question many times whether Quinlan has abandoned his loyalty to the Republic and the Jedi, going rogue to perhaps truly join Dooku in his cause. Despite knowing that Quinlan would ultimately fail due to the events of Episode 3, the journey to finding out Quinlan's true affiliations, his struggle with the dark side, and even his survival of Order 66 made his story all the worth reading. The events that surrounded his mission added context to the films that I couldn't possibly have imagined. So many years later, upon the announcement of his appearance in TCW, I had high expectations, and this was long before the retcons of the expanded universe had taken place. Well, this is where it went quickly downhill. I believe that TCW would spark new interest in the character as it had done with figures like Plo Koon and Kit Fisto, but the episode ended up being a total dud in terms of character introduction and story potential. Quinlan Vos was introduced as something of a maverick and an investigator, but his personality was more akin to that of a galactic surfer dude, as opposed to his usual shadowy and potentially volatile demeanor. This would be the only episode Quinlan Vos would appear in for any meaningful time, and his poor Kabata showings forced dedicated EU fans to question whether the writers of TCW were at all familiar with the old source material. Post-retconning of the EU and with the cancellation of the Clone Wars TV series, we discover that Quinlan Vos was to get his own story arc, teaming with Asajj Ventress, with the same purpose of that in the Republic comic series, to uncover the Second Sith. While some unfinished clips of this arc were publicly released, the story was adapted into a novel written by Christie Golden, titled Dark Disciple. I bought this book the day of release and read it all in one sitting the day after, and I have to say, it was this very moment that I realized the character of Quinlan Vos would not even appear as a shadow as his former self within the new continuity. I won't go into too long of a tangent regarding my problems with the novel, because I already have a video over 20 minutes long that I posted 2 years ago, detailing every issue I had in grueling detail. I feel the same way now about the novel that I did then. Thulm was killed off and is nothing but a footnote in the story. He doesn't even formally appear in the novel as himself. The story is focused too much on a contrived and superficial relationship between Quinlan Vos and Asajj Ventress. Quinlan Vos becomes absurdly powerful for the sake of plot convenience. And finally, and most controversially, Quinlan Vos meets virtually no consequence at the end of his story. Despite having killed 2 of the Jedi Order and have been complicit in many of the Separatist war crimes, all is forgiven at the end of the novel, as he is given a slap on the wrist, and Obi-Wan Kenobi as his glorified parole officer. This is made all the more insulting with the death of Asajj Ventress at the conclusion of the story, which ended up being equally inconsequential. I had this video on the back burner for years, believing that ultimately, my nostalgia for Quinlan Vos and the expanded universe will get in the way of having any hope for an unbiased perspective. As time passed on, I began to believe that it was I who was at fault here. It was obvious that Dark Disciple was made to attract the fans of the expanded universe and bring them into the new continuity. But how could I realistically believe that Quinlan Vos' story was going to stack up exactly to what I felt about the EU stories? It is proven that people have a special affection and bias for what they grew up with and were first exposed to. So how could I have any fair criticisms against Quinlan with the new continuity? But I could not get over the fact that Quinlan Vos did not feel like Quinlan Vos. Instead, he felt like a generic anti-hero who faces the same battle with the dark side that countless Star Wars characters have gone through. Surely his circumstances and actions were a bit more extreme, but if Quinlan had been given a different name within this novel, I would not have assumed it was him. I would have assumed it was a new unhinged and radical Jedi character the writers had created. I had a bit of a theory as to why Quinlan Vos, as I knew him, felt so strangely absent within TCW and this novel, but I realized my bias and nostalgia for the character was going to get in the way of making fair comparisons, so I decided to ask others. 2 of my good friends, Rico Chica Maliko and Great Jedi 91 here on YouTube, are of similar age and just as big fans of the EU as me, if not bigger. They are more than familiar with Quinlan Vos as seen in the expanded universe, but they had not yet read Dark Disciple, so have not had much exposure to Quinlan Vos as he is shown in the new canon. The question I asked is this: what do you think defines Quinlan Vos the most, and in what way do you think he is unique from other anti-hero-esque characters in Star Wars? Both answers were similar and basically mirrored my own thoughts exactly. While both had made some point on the temptation of the dark side and his unhinged and sometimes unpredictable persona, it is truly Quinlan's relationship with his surrounding cast and how they had helped him to develop as a character that truly made him unique. There have been countless stories of Jedi being tempted by the dark side, and there really isn't anything unique anymore about this inner struggle. We have seen it countless times, even back in 2005 when the Republic comic series was first published. Dark Disciple sets out to do much of what the Republic comic series did, having Quinlan Vos infiltrate the Separatists and nearly become what he had vowed to destroy. So while the original origin story isn't present, the main crux of Quinlan's tale doesn't look too different when written on paper, but it still feels bare bones, because ultimately it was how Quinlan interacted with his supporting cast, and how they both shaped his experiences, and how he had shaped their experiences that made the story so special. Like Rico had said, Quinlan struggled with temptation and put on a rather dark persona, but he could still be empathetic and be a father figure to Aayla Secura, showing a soft side of him we would not have believed existed by neither the way he looks or many of his actions. Thulm was also Quinlan Vos' rock throughout this story, never giving up on him and forcing him to come to terms with his inner darkness, rather than just ignoring it. This does not even account for characters like Billy Grark, Colleen Hence, and even Count Dooku, who would largely shape him into the man he would become, by either adding tensions pulling him to different directions, or forcing him to come to terms with an aspect of himself he had not realized before. All of these characters had brought about some characteristic of Quinlan, showing complexity not often seen in Star Wars. He was a struggling Jedi, but also a devoted mentor. He was an unhinged rogue, but also a determined spy. He was a dark acolyte, but also an unsung hero. He was a ruthless killer, but also a living partner. All of these facets are shown because of those he had surrounded himself with and the experiences they had given him. In this new continuity, he's a Peter Parker without an Uncle Ben, and a Bruce Wayne without an Alfred. The surrounding characters are just as pivotal to Quinlan as Quinlan is to himself. Like Grey Jedi 91 had said, when you take all the supporting cast and experiences away, you are left with a character that looks interesting, but just simply isn't. So the question is, will we ever see a Quinlan Vos anything like the incantation we had in the Dark Horse comics? I believe the chances of that are very low, given the state of Quinlan Vos have been left in, and how constraining his story potential is, despite the lack of consequences following Dark Disciples' conclusion. It doesn't help that the most pivotal characters typically surrounding him either have been killed off or left completely absent from the canon. I think in order to quote-unquote fix Quinlan as a character, there has to be some radical changes in order to set him up in a scenario where he can partially resemble his former self or facets of characters who were pivotal to him. At the conclusion of Dark Disciple, we are left with the death of Asajj Ventress and pretty much the extinction of the Dathomiri Night Sisters as we know them. Quinlan had received Dathomiri training, and is now probably the only character with the new canon that knows of the rituals and culture on a profound and personal level. What if Quinlan Vos decided to leave the Jedi Order, or was kicked out, and went back to Dathomir in order to restart the faction in secret? These adepts of his would not only be his pupils, but also work to attract the attention of the Galactic Empire, being placed strategically upon the galaxy for the purposes of recruitment. Imagine an infiltration of Darth Vader's Inquisitors, in which an older and wiser Quinlan plays a role similar to the one Thulm had in Republic, but still retains some uniqueness that allows plenty of story potential that we have not seen yet. A new character could be the Quinlan Vos type character of this era, and Quinlan could play the forewarning and wise master, who had himself lived through a similar struggle. Obviously, he would not be the Quinlan of the EU, but he would have characteristics that would harken back and pay respect to the old source material, while still telling a completely new and unpredictable tale. I think it would be interesting to see an infiltration of the Inquisitors within the Galactic Empire, and I would hope that it would either be a comic series or a novel, in order for the new spy master Quinlan to be as dark and mature as it needed to be. So all in all, while I think Quinlan Vos as shown in the new continuity has largely been smothered by inconsequential and lackluster storytelling, I do think there is ways to rectify these issues, at least partially. I do have to say though that I am skeptical of the current Star Wars writers' familiarity with the old source material, and I simply do not think they have the passion for the expanded universe that would merit their sympathy. I also think that they do not have a vision for a large overall narrative at the scale of what we had seen previously, and are more content with smaller and more self-contained stories. While I am not holding my breath to see new and interesting tales of Quinlan Vos within this new continuity, I will always see him as the face of the expanded universe, and a prime example of how well-planned story development and deep character interaction can bring such a figure to life. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope I didn't sound too biased, but I do sincerely believe that the expanded universe version of Quinlan told a more compelling story. With the Clone Wars TV series being recontinued, how big of a spotlight do you think Quinlan Vos will receive after the events of Dark Disciple? Do you think he'll be written as a more complex and interesting character with a new continuation of the series? Or do you think he'll be relegated to a smaller and insignificant role? Let me know in the comments down below. It is my sincere hope that this video ages very badly, and I'd be proven wrong if we were to see Quinlan Vos more as he were as compared to how he stands currently. Well, that's enough for me for now, guys. Once again, thanks for watching, and like always, may the Force be with you.